Have you ever met a man who seems too accommodating? He listens well, gives without being asked, praises you before you even finish your thought. At first, it feels like admiration, respect, even love. But after a while, something feels missing. You start to wonder, where is he in all this? Because behind the man who prioritizes pleasing a woman isn't always love. It's often anxiety in disguise. When a man makes pleasing a woman his primary instinct, it often has less to do with love and more to do with performance. On the surface, it appears generous, attentive, and emotionally intelligent. He listens, adapts, anticipates. He becomes what he thinks she wants. But beneath this choreography is something far more vulnerable, a belief that he must earn love by performing worthiness, that his value depends on how well he plays the part of the perfect man. This performance is rarely conscious. It often begins in childhood. He may have learned early on that being accepted came at a cost: obedience, helpfulness, silence. Perhaps he saw that expressing his own desires led to punishment, neglect, or emotional withdrawal. So he learned to please as a way of staying safe. It became a survival mechanism. He discovered that if he made himself agreeable, he could stay close to affection. He could belong. And that lesson hardened into a strategy. In adulthood, this dynamic often continues. He may enter romantic relationships believing that his job is to be emotionally available at all times, to suppress conflict, to never upset his partner. But in doing so, he stops being present and starts being performative. He is not responding to her reality. He is responding to a fantasy of who he believes she needs him to be. The result? He gives too much, too fast, too easily. Not because she has earned his trust, but because he believes love is a transaction, and his side of the deal is constant approval. But there is a hidden cost in this. When pleasing becomes a performance, authenticity disappears. The man loses contact with his own needs. He cannot ask for what he truly wants, because he fears it might disrupt the connection. He cannot say no, because boundaries feel like rejection. He becomes a mirror, reflecting back her emotions, desires, and rhythms, while hiding his own, and while he may believe this makes him safe, in reality it makes him disappear. What starts as connection turns into invisibility. A woman may initially feel cared for, seen, adored, but over time she may begin to feel something is missing. Not because he's doing something wrong, but because he isn't being anything solid. There is no anchor, no center, no contrast. Just a man in perpetual performance, hoping to be chosen for the role of the good one. Pleasing in this way is not intimacy. It's a coping mechanism dressed in warmth. It's an avoidance of self-expression disguised as devotion. It may look like love, but it's fueled by fear. And fear, no matter how carefully managed, always leaves a trace. In the silence between his generosity and his unmet needs, the truth lingers, that being loved for who you are is far more terrifying than being liked for who you pretend to be. Fear of rejection is one of the most silent and powerful forces, shaping the behavior of men who consistently put a woman's needs before their own. It is not just a passing emotion. It is a deep psychological undercurrent that drives the way they speak, behave, and relate. This fear doesn't always look like terror. Often it wears the mask of kindness, patience, and attentiveness. But underneath, it is a constant negotiation with the anxiety that if he doesn't give her what she wants, she will leave. And if she leaves, it will confirm his worst fear that he is not enough as he is. For many of these men, rejection is not just about the end of a relationship. It feels existential. It's a return to an old wound, often unhealed, often unconscious. Perhaps as a child, love was conditional. Affection came only when he was well-behaved, emotionally quiet, or pleasing to a parent's expectations. He learned early that his own needs were less important than maintaining harmony, that his truth could cost him connection. So he buried his fear under compliance. He smiled when he was sad. He agreed when he disagreed. He gave up the right to disappoint. As a man, This pattern doesn't just vanish. Instead, it becomes a personality. He becomes the guy who never says no, the one who listens more than he speaks, the one who apologizes even when nothing is his fault. Rejection in his mind isn't just painful, it's confirmation of an identity he's terrified to face, unwanted, unworthy, unlovable. So he lives in a state of quiet self-betrayal, constantly adjusting who he is to avoid the sharp sting of abandonment. But the irony is this: in trying to avoid rejection, he often invites it. A woman may initially appreciate his attentiveness, but over time she may sense that he is not rooted in his own truth, that his agreement is not always sincere, that his presence feels more like performance than partnership. And intimacy requires friction. It requires the courage to be real, to risk disappointing the other person in order to remain connected to oneself. When he cannot offer that, the connection loses depth. It becomes pleasant but hollow. Fear of rejection also limits his emotional range. He avoids conflict, not because he's peaceful, but because he's scared. He avoids making strong decisions, not because he's indecisive, but because he doesn't want to bear the weight of disapproval. He suppresses his own needs, thinking that silence is strength, when in fact it's submission. This fear shapes how he loves, how he desires, and how he shows up in every intimate exchange. And until it is faced, not managed, not avoided, but truly faced, it will continue to define his relationships. Because when a man is terrified of being rejected, he does not love freely, he loves carefully. And love, when filtered through fear, always comes with a cost. Conditional masculinity is the quiet framework that shapes many men's inner worlds without them even realizing it. It is the idea that their worth as men is not inherent, it must be earned. And the currency is performance. Performance in relationships, in behavior, in emotional restraint. From a young age, boys receive subtle messages. Be strong but not too emotional. Be capable but not controlling. Be giving but never needy. And somewhere along the way, masculinity becomes a role to be played, not a state to be embodied. When a man learns that his masculinity is conditional, he internalizes the belief that love and acceptance are not guaranteed, they are rewards. Rewards for self-denial, for meeting expectations, for being safe enough to love. He becomes a man who gauges his value by how well he can manage others' perceptions of him, especially in the eyes of women. He doesn't simply show up in a relationship as himself, he shows up as who he thinks she wants him to be. He becomes adaptable to a fault, predictable, controlled. This creates a subtle fracture in his sense of identity. On the surface, he may seem emotionally attuned and eager to please, but beneath that, there is often a quiet fear of being found out, of being seen as too much or not enough. Because if his masculinity is conditional, then every interaction becomes a test. Will I be enough this time? Did I say the right thing? Did I give her what she needed without making it about me? And if the answer feels uncertain, shame begins to fill the silence. In romantic relationships, this man may suppress his needs, not because he lacks them, but because expressing them feels dangerous. He doesn't want to be seen as demanding or needy. He fears that desire might come across as entitlement, so he packages his love in self-sacrifice. He offers support instead of opinion. He listens without ever interrupting. He says yes before he even considers what his no might be, all to maintain a sense of approval that feels fragile, conditional. But this dynamic doesn't create deep intimacy, it creates dependency. He needs her validation to feel like a man, and she starts to sense that the man in front of her is performing rather than engaging. There's no grounded center, no I in the relationship, only you. And over time, that imbalance can feel suffocating, even if it's wrapped in affection. Conditional masculinity teaches men that to be good is to be useful, that to be strong is to be silent, that to be loved is to be compliant. And in doing so, it robs them of the right to be whole. They live not from their core, but from their caution. Not from desire, but from duty. And they carry this weight quietly, constantly seeking permission to be themselves, without ever realizing they've had it all along. Avoidance of power in men who constantly seek to please women is often mistaken for humility or emotional maturity, but beneath it lies a complex psychological pattern. These men don't avoid power because they lack the capacity for leadership or direction. They avoid it because they associate power with danger. Somewhere in their past, they learned that being powerful meant being hurtful, aggressive, or unsafe. They disowned their ability to take up space because they feared it might lead to rejection, criticism, or the replication of harm. To avoid power is to remain inoffensive, to blend in, to never be the source of someone else's discomfort. These men often confuse power with control and control with abuse. They equate decisiveness with domination and assertion with aggression. As a result, they retreat into emotional passivity. They become supportive, agreeable, and gentle, not because it's who they truly are, but because it feels safer than being perceived as overpowering. In relationships, this often manifests as indecision. When a woman asks what he wants, he redirects the question, "Whatever you prefer." When she seeks direction, he hesitates, "I don't want to impose." What seems like deference is actually avoidance. He's not yielding out of generosity, he's avoiding the discomfort of taking the lead, because to lead means to be seen. To make a choice is to risk being wrong. To hold a boundary is to risk upsetting someone. And for a man who fears disconnection more than dishonesty, this risk feels too high. But the problem is, when a man avoids power, he also avoids presence. He's physically there but emotionally elusive. He listens but rarely reveals. He shows up but without grounded authority. And over time this erodes trust. Women may initially feel safe with such a man. He's gentle, accommodating, non-threatening. But they often begin to crave something more solid. A man who knows who he is, what he wants, and where he's going. Someone who can hold the weight of disagreement without folding. Avoiding power also stifles intimacy. True connection requires two whole people, not one person leading and another disappearing. When a man disowns his power, he silences his instincts. He censors his truths. He becomes more focused on avoiding conflict than fostering connection. And that creates a dynamic where everything feels smooth, but nothing feels deep. These men often believe they are protecting women from harm, when in truth they are protecting themselves from vulnerability. Power, in its healthy form, is not about control, it's about presence. It's the ability to stand in one's truth with clarity and respect. It's the courage to say, "This is where I am," even if it's not what the other person wants to hear. But to embody that kind of power, a man must first unlearn the belief that his strength is inherently threatening. He must reclaim power, not as dominance, but as grounded self-expression. And until he does, he will continue to choose safety over authenticity. And in doing so, forfeit the very connection he so deeply desires. Emotional transaction is the quiet, often invisible contract that many men who prioritize pleasing women operate under. It's not always verbalized, but it shapes their every gesture, compliment, and sacrifice. The unspoken belief is this: if I give you everything, my attention, my validation, my availability, you will stay. You will choose me, you will love me. It appears as devotion, but it's a strategy, a trade, and one with a hidden cost. These men don't necessarily intend to manipulate. In fact, many of them are deeply sincere in their efforts to be kind and supportive. But underneath the surface of their giving is often a fear that they aren't enough on their own. That if they don't keep offering something of value, emotional labor, reassurance, constant understanding, they'll be dismissed or forgotten. Their giving isn't just generosity, it's a method of securing emotional security. It's a way of avoiding rejection by creating a sense of obligation in the other person. This transactional mindset usually has early roots. Many of these men grew up in environments where love had to be earned. Maybe affection came with strings attached. Maybe emotional presence was inconsistent. and they learn to read the room, to anticipate moods, to soothe others in order to maintain peace. They became caretakers before they became adults. And now in their relationships, they unconsciously repeat that dynamic, giving in order to receive, pleasing in order to matter. The result is a relationship dynamic that feels lopsided. He is always doing, checking in, supporting, sacrificing, while expecting silently that his efforts will be acknowledged and returned. But because the transaction is unspoken, the woman may not even realize what's expected of her. She may interpret his giving as free-flowing, not conditional. And when she doesn't reciprocate in the way he silently hoped, resentment begins to grow. He feels unappreciated, overlooked, maybe even used. But the truth is he never asked for what he needed. He just kept giving, hoping it would be enough. Over time, this can lead to emotional exhaustion and confusion. He wonders why his relationships feel unfulfilling, despite all his efforts. She wonders why she feels guilt instead of connection. What's missing is authenticity. True emotional intimacy isn't built on exchange, it's built on expression. It requires transparency, not quiet contracts. When a man offers himself from a place of fear, even his love feels like a negotiation. This pattern also makes it difficult for him to receive, because if giving is how he earns love, then receiving feels selfish, or worse, undeserved. So he deflects compliments, minimizes his needs, avoids asking for help. He convinces himself that needing nothing makes him stronger, when in reality it just keeps him distant, not just from others, but from himself. Emotional transaction might look like love, but it is rooted in insecurity. And as long as love remains a currency to be traded rather than a truth to be shared, both people in the relationship remain stuck in roles, never fully seen, never truly free. The cost of self-abandonment is rarely immediate. It doesn't announce itself in a single dramatic moment. It accumulates quietly, steadily over time. For men who are conditioned to please women first, the first thing they often sacrifice is not their time, their energy, or their boundaries, it's themselves. Their voice, their desire, their sense of who they are when no one is watching. They start to shape themselves around the emotional needs of another person, and in doing so, slowly vanish from their own lives. Self-abandonment begins with small choices. Not speaking up when something feels off. Saying yes to avoid disappointing her. Shrinking their truth in moments that require honesty. These acts don't seem significant in isolation, but collectively they form a life that is reactive rather than authentic. A man begins to live not from his core, but from anticipation, trying to predict what will keep him loved, wanted, or chosen. This often leads to internal dissonance. Outwardly he appears agreeable, even content. Inwardly he is fragmented. There's a version of him that's performing, adapting, managing connection like a job. And there's another part, buried, ignored, that longs to be seen without condition, that wants to speak without filtering, that wants to want without apologizing. But he fears that revealing this part would be too much. So he abandons it, again and again. Over time, this pattern doesn't just affect the relationship, it begins to erode his self-worth. Because when a man consistently puts another person's comfort above his own integrity, he sends himself a message. You don't matter as much. That message may not be conscious, but it lingers. It shows up in self-doubt, in passive resentment, in a kind of emotional fatigue that doesn't go away with rest, because it's not physical, it's existential. It's the exhaustion of always being on while never being truly felt. This self-abandonment also warps how he experiences intimacy. He becomes afraid to bring his full self into the relationship, convinced that doing so will drive her away. He equates love with self-erasure, so closeness begins to feel like a threat. The more he gives, the less he feels known. The more he accommodates, the more he disappears. He wants to be loved, but the version of himself he offers isn't real. It's curated, softened, incomplete. And perhaps the most painful cost is this: she may eventually leave, not because he wasn't enough, but because she couldn't feel him. And that becomes the final betrayal. Not hers, but his own. He spent so much time trying to protect the connection that he failed to protect his own presence within it. And when the relationship ends, he's not just heartbroken, he's disoriented. Because he doesn't know who he is, without the role he was playing. Self-abandonment is subtle. It looks like compromise. It feels like caring. But underneath, it's a slow disconnection from one's truth. And no amount of external validation can replace the absence of a self that was never fully allowed to stay. The man who pleases first does not do so out of malice or manipulation. He does it out of a deep unspoken fear that who he is might not be enough. Beneath his attentiveness is often a boy who learned to trade authenticity for acceptance, desire for duty, and presence for performance. He became kind to be safe, agreeable to be loved, and invisible to avoid loss. But in doing so he gave away the very parts of himself that make love real, his edge, his truth, his selfhood. Each gesture of overgiving, each avoidance of conflict, each swallowed no is not just about her, it is about him. About the wound he still carries. About the belief that love is earned only through sacrifice. But love that demands the death of self is not love. It is survival disguised as romance. To heal this pattern is not to become selfish or hardened. It is to reclaim what was lost. To be willing to be felt, even at the risk of rejection. To speak, even when silence feels safer. To lead, not with control, but with clarity. And to love, not as a transaction, but as an act of presence. Because the man who stops pleasing to be chosen, chooses himself. And that is where love, true, mutual, grounded love can finally begin.